Hello, friends, and happy holidays. I'm Jeffrey Rosen, President and CEO of the National Constitution Center, and welcome to We the People, a weekly show of constitutional debate. The National Constitution Center is a nonpartisan nonprofit chartered by Congress to increase awareness and understanding of the Constitution among the American people. In this episode, Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Edward Larson discusses his newest book, Declaring Independence: Why 1776 Still Matters. It traces the idea of American independence in that pivotal year and its continued significance today. This program is presented in partnership with Citizen Travelers, a nonpartisan civic engagement initiative of travelers. It was streamed live on November 24th, 2025. Ed, it is always an honor and a joy to welcome you back to the National Constitution Center.
Jeff, thank you so much. I thoroughly enjoy every conversation we have together.
Well, there are many books about the Revolutionary War, but yours is unique because it's both a description of what happened blow by blow, 2 months by 2 months in 1776, and you also focus on a key intellectual development, which is the fact that when 1776 began, almost no patriot leader supported independence, and by the end of that year, they all flipped. Tell us why you decided to write this book and what you learned in writing it.
Well, of course, thank you for the question. Of course, the Revolutionary War matters, and that's captured in Ken Burns' wonderful television series. But you go back then, and you ever since, what do people mention? They don't say the spirit of the revolution. They say the spirit of 1776. Even back then, they talked about the spirit of 1776. You look at the seal of the United States, which was adopted the next year in 1777. It's on the back of your $1 bill if you ever want to look at it. And what it has is that weird pyramid. And across the top, it says something new under the sun. It's in Latin, but that's a way to translate it. And then it has the words in Roman numerals, 1776. So from the very beginning until now, people look back on 1776. So what my question is, okay, well, I know why 1775 matters. That's the Battle of Lexington and Concord. That's Bunker Hill. I know why 1781 matters, because that's the Battle of Saratoga, Battle of Yorktown. 1777 is the Battle of Saratoga, and that was important. I know why the 1789 matters, because that's the Constitution. But why do they look at 1775? So what I did is I went back and read through the newspapers for that year to see what was being written. I read through the letters of the founders for that year. I read through the letters of the soldiers for that year. And what I found was, as you suggest, a remarkable transition. Captured in a way, the year before, after the Battle of Lexington and Concord, the Congress, there in Philadelphia, right where you are, adopted the army, the militia army, the 20,000 person militia army surrounding the British in Boston as a Continental Army with the adoption of the Declaration of the Causes of Necessity for taking up arms. But if you read it, what it says, that's just 1775. It says, we have not raised armies with the ambitious design of separating from Great Britain, but in defense of the freedom that is our birthright as subjects of the king. And then they send the olive branch petition to King George, pledging their fidelity to your majesty's person, family, and government. So they were still loyalists, captured by your John Dickinson from Pennsylvania and Delaware. What changes, and it changes in January, it's a profound transition, and I sort of see three things causing it. First, if you look through the newspapers in January, you see the first publication in America, one came out the last week in December, but other than that, the first publication throughout the colonies of the King's speech from the throne in October, where he declares the colonies in open rebellion and vows to send the largest foreign British army and navy in history and thousands of British mercenaries to crush these Americans. Simultaneously, in those newspapers, you see the word from January 1, when the British, with dozens and dozens, actually 100 ships, bombard Norfolk, Virginia. Norfolk, Virginia was in the second largest city, second most important port in the American South. And the way it's presented in the newspapers, the city is obliterated with the fire and bombardment. That happens on January 1, but the word gets out throughout the month in the newspapers. And finally, and this is critical, in January, Thomas Paine, there in Philadelphia, publishes the first edition of Common Sense, and it spreads like wildfire. Nobody has ever seen the impact of a publication of that sense ever before. It spreads throughout the colonies. It's read everywhere. It's purchased everywhere. Sales that were as many as all the other pamphlets put together. And in that document, it's ideas. It's ideas that he worked with Benjamin Rush there in Philadelphia. It's wonderfully written. And he starts with an origin story that's borrowed from Locke's second treatise on government, that the people it's not true, but people started out individually with liberty, and they collectively chose through social contract to form representative governments where their own representatives would give up some of their liberty for their own security and to promote their happiness. He uses those three phrases repeatedly. And then turns on the king and said, the problem is not, as has been argued before this, it's not taxation without representation. That's merely a symptom. The problem is authoritarian government. The problem is the king. As he writes in there, of more worth is one honest man to society and in the sight of God than all the crowned ruffians that ever lived. And he's not limiting that to monarchs. It's authoritarian rule. He calls for rule of law. He writes, the will of the king is as much the law of the land in Britain as is an absolutist France. In America, the law is king. For in an absolute government, the king is the law. So in free countries, the law ought to become king. And suddenly, all the problems make new sense. They understand the bombardment of Norfolk. They understand the king's speech from the throne. They understand that taxation without representation is merely a symptom. Same way with the proclamation of 1763 banning the colonists from moving west. The same way with the Declaratory Act, the same way with Somerset. All this is, the problem is authoritarian government, and the answer is representative government with free, fair, and frequent elections. And suddenly the scales are lifted. You can read it in Washington's response, in John Adams' response, in Jefferson's response, in Abigail Adams' response. And you can read it in the soldiers, because Washington has it read to the troops in Boston. You can read it in their letters. Suddenly they see this in a whole new way. That is the American Revolution. Now, I'll just close this tirade with, years later, John Adams, long after he's out of office, he writes to Thomas Jefferson, long after he's no longer president. He writes, what was the revolution? And of course, Adams always answers his own question. He goes on to write, it wasn't the war. The war was simply a symptom and consequence of the revolution. The revolution was in the minds of the American people, and it was all over by 1776.
Absolutely extraordinarily. A beautifully put description of the centrality of common sense in changing the minds of the people. And as you say, convincing them that the problem was authoritarian government and the solution was representative government with free and fair elections. Also remarkable that you say that much of this was due to a chance encounter between Thomas Paine and Benjamin Rush. And you note that Rush had denounced slavery as inconsistent with natural law, and Paine drew the connection between the idea that assailing Americans for demanding their own liberty while denying it to others. Is it the case that it was really anti-slavery sentiments that transformed Paine and in that sense sparked the American Revolution?
Great observation, Jeff, and I think that was part of it. Paine, of course, was throughout his adult life, he was an abolitionist. Paine was tremendously opposed to human slavery, as was Rush, and they were early. Maybe add Benjamin Franklin, of course, add some of the Quakers in your area, but they were early on this issue. And if you look at the pamphlets throughout the period, going back to the Otis's first pamphlet against the Stamp Act and Sugar Act back in the James Otis from Massachusetts from 1765. But you look at the others, they compare what the British Parliament back then, by the time of 1776, it's the king. It's not Parliament anymore, it's the king. But the Parliament is doing is making the American colonists into enslaving them. And they use the slavery metaphor with profound effect, partly because, unlike in England, in the colonies, the 13 colonies and the other British colonies in the Caribbean, there is chattel slavery. And so they see the effects of chattel slavery. And whatever they think about, whatever Jefferson and the others thought about keeping their own enslaved people, they certainly didn't want to become the enslaved people. And so Washington in his private letters and Jefferson and others write powerful places. We do not want to be their enslaved people.
Absolutely remarkable. And it is one reason, because of the power of the metaphor, that Paine, as you note, says that not short of 150,000 copies of Common Sense sold, and it transformed public opinion. Now, you describe the impact of Common Sense on Revolutionary era state constitutions, and that's the second big intellectual shift of this year that you describe. And a series of those constitutions adopted Paine's suggestion of a unicameral legislature, one house representing the people, most significantly Pennsylvania, which adopts the most democratic of all the state constitutions in 1776. Tell us about those democratic state constitutions and how Paine influenced them.
Well, new state constitutions were at the heart of the matter of 1776. Now think about it. America's in the middle of a war. And not only, sure, it starts in Boston, but it really takes shape after June, when the British come back. When they evacuate Boston, they don't go back to England. They go up to Nova Scotia. They go up to Halifax. And they're joined they start with 4,000. They join, so they come back into New York with 32,000 troops, the largest foreign British army of history up to that time. And so many ships that they would joke that you could walk from one side of the New York harbor to the other just on the decks of the ship. And in the midst of this war, which engulfs the Middle States, these states, the state, in some cases, conventions, like in Pennsylvania, in some cases, the state assembly in special session, write new constitutions. And so they took that time in the middle of war, and they believed those new state constitutions, the formative state constitutions of 1776, and virtually every state adopts a new one. Georgia, New York, it's 1777 before they finally get done, but they start working on them in 1776. The others get them in 1776. Massachusetts, they vote it down and they have to do a new one. These constitutions capture the idea of Republican government. Now, they were essential because prior to this, the colonies were under charters issued by the king or by Parliament, which put them under British rule. And therefore, John Adams argues in his most important pamphlet he ever wrote, Thoughts on Government, made me a real Adams fan, that what independence is not a declaration. That's why he didn't spend too much time working on it. He left that to Jefferson. Was new state constitutions. And so he writes Thoughts on Government, giving instructions of how to do it. Thomas Paine includes new state instructions on how to draft the Constitution, right in common sense. So they have two models, as it were, one bicameral, one where you have a two-house assembly, the other with a one. And Adams just captures it when he says and writes in Thoughts in Government, when, and then he includes an exclamation point, when had a people full power and a fair opportunity to form and establish the wisest and happiest governments that human wisdom can contrive. Adding in this that Republican governments are of governments of law, not of men. So this was what he announced, that, and then he secured from Congress to adopt the Resolution on Independent Governments, where he directs every colony to adopt a new constitution. And here's the quote right from his Resolution on Independent Governments, that there in Philadelphia, the Second Continental Congress adopts in May of 1776, adopt a constitution, quote, best conducive to the happiness and safety of their constituents in particular and America in general. I do want to emphasize that in Thomas Paine's Common Sense, and by the way, it's always Thomas Paine. I checked. It's never Tom Paine, despite one of the biographers using that as in his title. And you look at Adams' Thoughts on Government, you look at Jefferson before this, they all use this. What is the purpose of government? Well, as Paine says, liberty and security are the end of government, and the goal is the greatest sum of human happiness with the least national expense. All three, you get the three. Life, that's security. Life, liberty, and the pursuit or happiness. That's where Jefferson, a lot of people ask, I've often hear, how did Jefferson turn Locke's life, liberty, and property into life's liberty and pursuit of happiness? How brilliant of Jefferson. It wasn't Jefferson. That's what everyone was saying. Paine, Adams, all the rest. The purpose of government was to secure with security, life, liberty, and the happiness of the people. Now, think how revolutionary that was. Would George III ever said that his purpose was to protect the liberty and happiness of the people or promote it? Would Louis XIV, Mr. The State is Me, ever have said his purpose, the purpose of the British government or the Danish government under Christian IV, which was a key authoritarian government of the year, would they have ever said their purpose was to secure the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness of the people? That is the core of the revolution in the minds of human thought, the revolution of 1776. So it all goes together. Rule of law, representative government, and the purpose of government is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Wonderfully put. Now, for the founders, happiness meant not feeling good, but being good, not the pursuit of immediate pleasure, but the pursuit of long-term virtue. For private happiness, they thought self-mastery, self-control, lifelong learning. What did, in particular, Paine and Adams mean by public happiness? Did they disagree about that meaning? And how did they want to structure constitutions to achieve public happiness?
Well, they disagreed about the means. It's fascinating to follow John Adams. John Adams was one of the crustiest people who ever led our country, and very opinionated. And he had a high measure of his own self-worth. He deserved it. Again, I became a fan reading Thoughts in Government. But what he does is at first he's caught up in common sense, and he just raves about it, as does Abigail, who just absolutely is enthralled by it. But over time, Adams begins to say, well, the problem, common sense is not perfect. It's great on the symptoms, but I don't really trust his solution. That is a single branch legislature. I think he gives, which then Benjamin Franklin, right in the middle of the war, when he's supposed to be doing, when he's working on the Articles of Confederation, when he's preparing to go to Europe as the ambassador to France, when he's working on the Declaration of Independence, he too is chairing the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, where they draft the Constitution that reflects Paine's ideas. Meanwhile, Adams writes Thoughts on Government, where he says what we need is two houses. We need checks and balances. We need a lower house that's more popular, an upper house that's somewhat more elite, but still, both of them, all power is in the legislature. Both of them don't trust the executive. Very little power in the executive. The executive merely must execute laws in both of them. They both ask for frequent elections. They talk about fair. That is, we want the whole people. They would have hated gerrymandering. We want the whole people represented in this government, and annual elections so the people control it, free, fair, and frequent. That they agree on. What Adams wants a check and balance between the two branches. What Paine suggests and is carried through in Benjamin Franklin's Constitution for Pennsylvania was the check was within the people. Pennsylvania adopts, as you pointed out, one of the broadest suffrage, free adult males, almost universal suffrage. New Jersey goes a step further by letting property-owning women vote as well. But the check in the Pennsylvania Constitution, and it reflects Benjamin Franklin, the great tinkerer, the great inventor of the Franklin stove. What he has is the people checking the people. So what he has is a one-house legislature. It's true, but if they pass a law, to pass a law, first it has to be published and distributed widely. Second, the title has to encapsulate everything in the law so people can see what it's about. It must be on one subject only. No big, beautiful bills. No, one subject so the people can understand it. And then the legislature passes it. Then it gets published. And then there's a new election for the next legislature. And the people can vote based on the laws that have been passed. And then it must be repassed by the next legislature. So the people are checking the people rather than a lower house checking an upper house. And then after 7 years, the people elect a board of censors, which go over all the laws that have been passed twice by two different legislatures and become law over the previous 7 years and determine which are constitutional or which aren't constitutional. All the unconstitutional ones are then announced, and then the people hold an election to hold a convention to review whether those laws are unconstitutional. So what you talk about the importance of virtue. Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Paine trusted the people, and they wanted to empower the people and the popular virtue, because they thought people could become, individual leaders could become corrupted and change their idea of virtue rather than serving the public good and promoting liberty, security, and happiness. Well, to put a modern phrase, going down to Epstein's Island and having a good time. That was not virtue. And Franklin was really remarkable in the way he trusted the people.
Fascinating. So, as you put it, the Paine, there are 4 state constitutions that are adopted after July 4th. Pennsylvania adopts Paine's version of an all-powerful unitary assembly. And then 3 other states, Maryland, North Carolina, and Delaware, adopt Adams' vision of a balanced constitution with a stronger executive and bicameral legislature. And this comes down to a different view about human nature, with Paine and Franklin and Pennsylvania trusting the people and fearing leaders, and Adams with his darker view of human nature, wanting to separate the various orders into 3 branches and to have a stronger executive. Did this debate occur during 1776 itself?
It very much did. And you can add New Jersey. You can add new constitutions as well. As you said, South Carolina. South Carolina was actually before July. Several were before July, came down before July. Virginia, of course, was before. It was a difference, somewhat of a difference, but both, of course, were putting all power in the legislature, not an individual person. All had a very weak executive and power. But whether you needed to separate, so you had more, the upper house being more restrictive property rights and less restrictive in the House, that would be a difference rather than the people checking the legislators, as in the Franklin approach. But one thing they all agreed with, and I think that one thing that captures this is during June of 1776, when the common knowledge has Jefferson engaging in drafting this elaborate Declaration of Independence, he was barely spending, when you really follow his letters, he was barely spending any time on the Declaration of Independence. He was devoting his entire energy to working on the state constitution for Virginia, which George Mason was engaged at in Williamsburg working on that. Jefferson was writing drafts and sending them down. And as Jefferson wrote in one of the letters in that month, he wrote about the Virginia Constitution, not about the Declaration of Independence. The Virginia Constitution said, in truth, that is referring to the state constitution, in truth, it is the whole object of the present controversy. For if a bad government be instituted for us in future, it would have been as well to have accepted the first bad one offered from beyond the water, meaning England, without the risk and expense of contest. He thought the whole thing was about new state constitutions, Republican government, rule of law. That is, the law is king, the king is not law. And so Adams would later kid or sort of refer, you know how he always diminished others. And he said, when about the Declaration of Independence, he said, it was the piecework of an afternoon. It was nothing new. It was the piecework of an afternoon. And Jefferson comes back and says, well, they didn't ask me to write anything new. They asked me to capture the sentiments that were prevailing. And so it's true. If you really work through the Declaration of Independence, it's just pieces much is taken from George Mason's Virginia Constitution. From the ending is all from Richard Henry Lee's resolution. The grievances appear in Jefferson's own 2-year-old summary view in his pamphlet. It's all put together. It's pieces. And all the ideas were there before. But when you think about it, it's magnificent. I compare it in my book to, it's all piecework, but it's like a fine Virginia quilt. He takes all these pieces and in a day or two, and it didn't take long, he pulls together a monumental work. So these ideas, think of that phrasing. Sure, we've heard in Thomas Paine, we've heard in Adams' Thoughts on Government, we've heard everywhere. Life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Well, put them together so beautifully. And if you think about it, that phrase, that inalienable rights, that phrase comes from Franklin. The inalienable rights, and those inalienable rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If you think about it, the way that has resonated through American history, if you want to, in my opinion, if you want to encapsulate what became the American dream is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's what, and you're right. By happiness, they didn't mean sensual pleasure. They meant virtue. They meant a deep-seated meaning that we as individuals have a right to pursue our own meaning as we personally understand it, and that it's not imposed on us by a king or overlords or sovereign. The North Carolina State Constitution of 1776 begins with the sentence, all political power is vested in and derived from the people only. Now, that was truly a revolutionary concept because before this, sovereignty rested in the king, the sovereignty rested in God. Sovereignty rested somewhere else. Now, for the first time, all political power is vested and derived from the people only. That was the revolution of 1776.
Wow. Say more about the revolution and the idea of sovereignty from something that was located in the king and parliament, as William Blackstone said, to one located in the people themselves, as James Wilson said. What were the major state constitutions and major figures in making that shift in sovereignty in 1776?
Really, every state constitution, every one of the new state constitutions in all the states adopt new constitutions in 1776. Now, I'll qualify that slightly. Georgia and New York, they didn't finally pass until early 1777. New Hampshire actually gets a jump on it, and it comes out in 1775. But in virtually all of them, Rhode Island and Connecticut, because their charters came from the Cromwell's Parliament, which was a non-monarchical one. They didn't need to draft new ones. But otherwise, they all spend time writing these formulative new state constitutions. And they take, structurally, they take one of two formats. They either begin with a Declaration of Rights, which again is something new, right in the Constitution, the Declaration of Rights, where political power vests, and then have grievances against the king, not parliament. It's the king now. The king's the problem. Authoritarian rule is the problem. Rule of law is the answer. They all have that. Or they're the opposite. They begin with grievances and then they have their resolution of rights or Bill of Rights or Declaration of Rights, whatever they want to call it. And then, and only then, do they go down to their structural issues. And there they differ between a one-house legislature, as Rhode Island will have, or Pennsylvania or Georgia, or a two-house legislature. And then however they divide up power, what powers the court has. They have this framework. And so then the grievances against the king and the rights of people become one way or the other. That becomes central. That's what the revolution was about. And that's what the transformation comes about in these formative state constitutions. And in those sense, the idea of sovereignty is central. Adams deals with it. Paine deals with it. Franklin deals with it. Jefferson deals with it. Mason deals with it. The writers in the South Carolina and North Carolina, both of which are very interesting constitutions, they deal with it. And what these people are thinking about is they're rethinking the very nature of government, and the purpose of government, liberty, security, and with the goal, as Paine says, the greatest sum of individual happiness with the least national expense. Now, only Paine, a good libertarian like Paine, would word it quite like that. But I think that's what's so amazing about Paine. It still resonates today with Americans.
Completely so. Well, let's go chronologically because you are so clear in doing just that. And we've set up chapter 1, which talks about the significance of common sense and how it changed the debate. And then in chapters 2 and 3, you talk about how the British evacuation of Boston and the Continental Congress moves like the resolution instructing the states to form a Republican government moves the country further on the path to independence. Tell us about that period.
I try to follow, because I'm trying to talk about why 1776 matters, and because my inspiration, why I decided to write the book, was reading chronologically the newspapers, the letters of Washington and Adams and Jefferson and all the others, and of the soldiers in the field. Because remember, the soldiers were already in the field in 1775. The Continental Army had been adopted in the middle of 1775. Washington had taken command of the troops in the middle of 1775 up in Massachusetts. So the war, as captured beautifully in Ken Burns' film series or in Rich Atkinson, and I never can give that man enough praise. If you want to learn about the military and you want to read a book about the military aspects of the Revolutionary War, Atkinson, 2 volumes are out, one more is coming, capture it beautifully. But what I see when I follow these things for the year, and your introduction suggests this, what I see is a constant interplay between words and deeds, actions and ideas, that it goes back and forth. That the soldiers writing, you read so many letters, many of the Massachusetts militia forces, and one of my ancestors was one of them, right there in the battle of the engagement of the Boston. Their letters to Adams and their other representatives in Philadelphia are so telling, because they're pleading with Adams, bring us independence. Adams had not yet announced for independence. John Hancock hadn't announced for independence. We shouldn't leave Hancock out. He was very important as leader of the Congress. And there are letters from these soldiers saying, you've got to give us more to fight for. It's not enough to fight for lower taxes. We've got to fight for something more. We can never trust these British. We cannot trust authoritarian rule. We can't trust a monarch. And whether it comes from generals like Warren or common sergeants, or which was what my ancestor was, or privates, they write these letters and they're saying, we need a cause. Just like in the Civil War, the importance of the cause of abolition was, as captured in the Emancipation Proclamation, was so important. So in the Revolutionary War, to give a purpose that we're fighting for independence, we're fighting for rule of law, that gave the cause that was bigger than just lower taxes.
Superb. Well, in chapter 4, you examine the intellectual inspirations of the Declaration, and you show how Jefferson was influenced centrally by 3 documents that arose out of Virginia: their Declaration of Rights, their new state constitution, and their resolution on independence, and on other sources as well. Tell us about the intellectual influences on the Declaration.
Well, Jefferson had wanted to leave Congress. He had wanted to go down because he thought the important thing happening was not a Declaration of Independence. He really believed to the depth of his soul that the important thing happening was writing a new state constitution, but he was a junior member of the delegation, and the important members wanted to go down. And they needed some representation, so they left Jefferson up. Thank goodness. Providence was guiding us once again. They left Jefferson up in Philadelphia. And so he kept working on the state constitution and kept sending documents down because he heard from the governor things were pretty much in flux. Well, they weren't in flux. George Mason had taken control of the whole affair. He didn't trust the others, and working on the Constitution, and was doing a magnificent job. And so you see in the exchange back and forth, Jefferson is writing, and what ends up being adopted is he writes what becomes the Declaration of Rights. That part gets grafted on to what Mason has written. And we see in this exchange this idea of what will become the Declaration of Independence. He's getting what Virginia is working on. He is also sending down parts that get added. And so those parts that he's reading and receiving from Virginia, receiving in Philadelphia, and the parts he's sending down, he takes those. And I mean, you can just read that portion of the Declaration of Independence is lifted directly from what Mason has developed. You look at his grievances, it's lifted directly from the grievances that are appearing in the various state constitutions and that he had summarized earlier in his own great summary view pamphlet. And then you look at the conclusion, and the conclusion is not, that's one thing that's dramatically changed from Jefferson's drafting. Congress drops his conclusion, leading to Benjamin Franklin's famous lines about the hat maker, and trying to console Jefferson. The end is lifted, that long ending, and the pithy ending that we have now, that's basically the resolution that the Virginia assembly has passed and sent up with Richard Henry Lee and gets presented in Philadelphia in June of 1776. And then when that resolution is presented, a committee of Jefferson, Adams, Franklin primarily, and two others, is put together to draft the Declaration of Independence. It falls on Jefferson not because it's in the wonderful musical 1776, because the others thought he could write better. I'll tell you, Adams never thought anybody could write better than him. But they thought it wasn't that important. But the key reason is Jefferson was the chair of the committee, and he was chair because he received the most votes. He received more votes. Adams and Franklin came in second and third in the number of votes. That's because all the southern states were voting for a southern member. And they had to pick Jefferson because all the other important Virginians had left Jefferson in Philadelphia. They'd gone down, just like all the important delegates to Philadelphia from North Carolina had left and were down in North Carolina writing their state constitution because they all thought the most important things were their state constitutions. It turns out because of Jefferson's brilliance. And primarily for that, because all the Congress had to do was adopt Richard Henry Lee's Virginia Resolution. But no, because of the brilliant way that just as Thomas Paine had pulled together the concerns and crystallized the concerns in common sense, so Thomas Jefferson beautifully pulls together the concerns that were pre-existing concerns and ideas, and so succinctly puts them that just as Thomas Paine's common sense was not only read, but also read aloud to huge groups, so Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence is not only read by individuals, but read aloud. And to capture the impact was when it was read in New York City. When New York City is surrounded by the largest British army in the history, overseas army in the history of the world, their harbor is filled with ships. They read this document and they rush out and tear down the larger-than-life size gilded equestrian statue in Bowling Green of George III. They tear down that statue, and then underneath the gilding, it's all lead. They melt down that statue for musket balls to use against the British. That was the inspirational effect of the Declaration of Independence.
That's extraordinary. And you show us so vividly the power of words. Just as Thomas Paine's Common Sense, which sold 150,000 copies, transformed public opinion, so the Declaration led the people to melt down the statue of King George. Is absolutely astonishing. I must ask, how the word similarities between Jefferson's Declaration and George Mason's are so similar, and Mason's Declaration was adopted on June 12th, 1776. I mean, of course, Jefferson had many intellectual influences: Aristotle, Cicero, Sidney, Locke, as he said. He had James Wilson by his side. But they're so similar. Did he actually just paraphrase Mason?
Yes, he had the document. And remember, that was Adams's critique. He was there. He was on the committee. And indeed, the only two men, apparently the committee didn't meet except at the beginning. And apparently Jefferson, we know, he shared copies with Adams and Franklin. They were the two great writers. They were brilliant writers. And they had them and they made their notes. Franklin famously adding, "We hold these truths to be self-evident rather than sacred." And the thought that these are self-evident, they weren't self-evident to anybody else in the world. This was new stuff. But yes, as Adams said, this is piecework. Yeah, he took Mason's, it wasn't something new. He took Mason's document that was so beautifully crafted and just plopped it in there. It worked. Changes here, changes added by Adams and Franklin. But he was lifting different parts and putting it together magnificently. But this is Mason's work, and I think it really helps to walk through it that way. And you get that sense of that more if you do what I happen to do. start with the year and follow all of these people, including Mason. I followed everything he wrote for everything we have. Those are all collected. And we worked down there in his home, in the archives at his home in Virginia. You get a great sense of how this is a collective act coming together. And that's how Jefferson self-admittedly viewed his role. Again, he was spending more time working on the Virginia Constitution than he was on the Declaration of Independence. And both of them, they're works for the ages.
They are indeed. We had Walter Isaacson on We the People last week, and his new book, The Greatest Sentence Ever Written, attributes the phrase self-evident to Franklin's edit, and says that it came from Hume and Locke, and the idea that there's a distinction between self-evident or rational truths and empirical or factual truths. You note in your footnote that Jill Lepore attributes the change to Jefferson. Who was it? And more significantly, was that a real contribution of Jefferson? Because the idea of self-evident rights does not appear in Mason's draft.
No, yes, I think, but it's Franklin. I attribute it to Franklin, and so does Jill Lepore. And Isaacson, that language, because Jefferson had written. We can see it in the cross out and the handwriting in it. Franklin was ill. He'd been sent up by because he was one of the only two members of the Continental Congress that could speak French. He'd been sent up to try to salvage the American invasion of France. And then he'd come back ill. And so he was in bed, but he got a draft and went over it. And yes, Franklin was an incredibly brilliant man. I mean, me and my other writings, I think there were two indispensable people in the Revolutionary War. There are others important, Jefferson, Adams, there are a lot of important people, but Franklin and Washington, indispensable. We wouldn't have had independence without them, in my opinion. But yes, self-evident. Franklin, best we can tell, Jefferson's words was sacred. These sacred truths, and that places it all in some sort of revelation, what makes something sacred. And Franklin apparently thought, no, from those different sources, thinking about it, he struggled over those words in Jefferson's draft. And self-evident. Now, when you think about it, the one thing these rights, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And you have to include that line because the whole idea of representative government doesn't make any sense if you believe in a hierarchical. The kings and the barons were higher and the people lower. No, you have to have created equal to make it make any sense. And of course, Mason had included that in the Virginia Constitution. It was amended somewhat after he had written it. But all men are created equal and endowed, and men, they mean men, because when Abigail Adams is thinking about it, she writes down, don't forget the ladies. Be sure to include the ladies in the women. And we can't forget that at the time, John Adams immediately replies, and I quoted in the letter, I laughed at your letter. And he doesn't laugh at Abigail much. I laughed at your letter. Rest assured, we will not give up our masculine system. That's how Adams replies at the time. So going on, we hold these truths as self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Okay, we hold these truths to be self-evident, and life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, if you're resting them on the sacred, it gives a different status. Suddenly, it's not really sovereignty of the people. Remember, all political power is vested and derived from the people only. If you want to make it on people, it has to come from the people. And therefore, where does it come? It's self-evident. Again, this wasn't self-evident because no other country in the world had ever said anything. Let me emphasize this. In the middle of the war, all the colonies write new written constitutions where the law becomes king. There were no other written constitutions in the history of the world. These were the first written constitutions ever written anywhere. And they did it in the middle of the war. So this is resting on popular sovereignty, and therefore they have to be self-evident truths. Franklin realized that. And that's one of the changes Jefferson, from all we can read, readily accepted. I think he saw it as soon as he read, he says, this is right.
Superb. Well, tell us about the major events of the fateful second half of the year after the Declaration is adopted in July. We have more state constitutions ratified. We have the Articles of Confederation proposed but not adopted because of divisions about suffrage and apportionment. And what were the crucial final acts that changed public opinion and put it squarely on the side of independence?
Well, I think public opinion had pretty much changed by July. And in August, finally, even Robert Morris comes around and agrees to it. He had originally voted against it. He comes around. John Dickinson never comes around. But I love that you raised that last part of the year because, as I said earlier, it was ideas led to actions. Deeds fostered ideas. It was a back and forth. And in the second half of the year, we see more people coming around, but a playing out of this because almost at the same time that they're in Philadelphia, the Declaration of Independence, Lee's resolution was adopted on the same day the British troops disembarked from the ships onto Staten Island, which was Loyalist controlled, as was eastern Long Island, and prepare for the invasion of New York. And then as the year plays out, you see this American army, which had moved down 20,000 men strong, 32,000 British, with this massive navy sweeping. There's the Battle of Long Island, Brooklyn Heights, the evacuation onto Manhattan, the fleeing or the removal of Washington's troops up north as Kips Bay, as the British come over, as they take the city of New York, which is just down in the southern part, and then push up through the Battle of Harlem Heights. And the Washington moving from being the aggressive general to, as they was calling him, Fabian, the retreating, strategic retreat, defeat at White Plains, or the pulling out of White Plains, that horrible disaster of leaving 2,000 soldiers at Fort Washington and their capture, and then the retreat of American troops under Washington across New Jersey. And so what you see is the war and the fierceness of the war. And now what you see during this period is the British atrocities, or at least presented as atrocities. The taking of these 2,000 soldiers at Fort Washington, which is in New York City, right across from where the bridge is in Washington Heights, and putting on prison ships, prison hulks in the East River, where these soldiers die in brutal conditions, and then the atrocities in New Jersey. This reinforces everything that Paine had said in the Common Sense and had been argued. These British are tyrants. The atrocities and so the Americans retreat back, and that helps. These atrocities help push these new state constitutions, push the conviction of the Americans that they must be independent. And then right at the end of the war, Washington has that not very militarily important, but for morale, comes back across with all the army he has left, 4,000 men, against a small British garrison at Trenton that is all made up of German mercenaries who, in the atrocities, were the major culprits, as presented you can read the newspapers. The atrocities in New Jersey and in the prison hulks were widely reported throughout the colonies. Then you have the Battle of Trenton, followed by the Battle of Princeton, and then Washington moving the tiny remnant of his army up to Morristown. So you get that action, reaction, so that really by the end of the war, when Thomas Paine published The Crisis, which comes out right on the eve of the Battle of Trenton, and people read The Crisis #1, again, these are the times that try men's souls. In common sense, he said this was going to be easy. Nobody can defeat us. Now he's saying we've got to fight on. And with that, the stage is set for what I consider mostly the military phase of the war that's captured so beautifully in Ken Burns's documentary and is captured in Atkinson's books that play out through with Franklin getting the alliance with France after the Battle of Saratoga, and then magnificently culminating in Virginia, where it all began, in the Battle of Yorktown.
Beautifully put. And at the end of the book, you talk about that shift in tone in Paine's American Crisis essays, the year-ending triumph in Trenton, you say, restored Paine's faith that Americans would prevail, even if it wouldn't come quickly. And you really make a case for how this was a revolution in people's opinions, sparked by print. You talk about the new state constitutions, pamphlets by Paine, a flow of newspaper articles, including those reprinting the words of the Declaration that transformed public opinion. You have such a powerful concluding thoughts about how, beginning with common sense and the bombardment of Norfolk and ending with the American crisis and the Battle of Trenton, public opinion was transformed. Tell us about that crucial significance of the year 1776.
It boils down to what we all know. Words matter. Ideas matter. People, sure, battles are important. Winning, they had to win the battles. No one can overestimate the importance of Lexington and Concord and Saratoga, but they mattered in part because they pushed ideas. And it was the ideas of Republican government or representative government, that the people, not the king, are sovereign. That the purpose of government, as Paine and Adams said, is liberty and security and the greatest sum of individual happiness. That's the purpose of government, not glorifying monarchs and kings and rulers, or as I love he said, crown ruffians. Those ideas mattered. They played out in the battlefield, and it took sacrifice. It took sacrifice by individuals, but the ideas drove those thoughts, and the ideas were what culminated in the state constitutions and ultimately the United States Constitution. And in this year of 1776, it was captured something new under the sun. The spirit of 1776 is what created our country and our remarkable experiment in popular sovereignty, where the people reign and they rule through their elected legislatures.
Ed Larson, for showing us how words matter in your wonderful new book, Declaring Independence, Why 1776 Matters. Thank you so much.
Jeff, thank you for having me, and thank you for the incredible work of the National Constitution Center.
This episode was produced by Bill Pollack and Griffin Ritchie. It was recorded by Scott Bomboy, David Stotts, Greg Scheckler, Kevin Kilburn, and mixed by Bill Pollack. Research was provided by Griffin Ritchie, Anna Salvatore, Trey Sullivan, and Tristan Worsham. Friends, it is the holidays. What a great time to get my new book, The Pursuit of Liberty, How Hamilton versus Jefferson Ignited the Lasting Battle Over Power in America. If you'd like a signed bookplate, please let me know at jrosen@constitutioncenter.org. And thank you for checking out the Pursuit podcast. All 12 episodes are now up. Pursuit, the Founder's Guide to Happiness. It was such an honor to co-host with Ken Burns and talk to great American historians about the founder's quest for self-mastery. Please recommend the show to friends, colleagues, or anyone, anywhere who's eager for a weekly dose of constitutional illumination, exploration, and debate. And always remember that the National Constitution Center is a private nonprofit. What a great time at the end of the year to make a donation to the podcast and to our nonpartisan mission of constitutional education and debate. You can do that by donating today at constitutioncenter.org/donate. And if you want to send me a note, if you like the podcast and you find it meaningful as part of your lifelong learning, I would love to hear from you. On behalf of the National Constitution Center, I'm Jeffrey Rosen.